So hello, academic writing students. Here we are again with another week of material. This week we were focused on a document-based question. So by now I've received many of your assignments, and it's time to talk about what I think we can pull from these documents and how we might answer the essential question that the document-based question was posing. So let's go to that question first, because that's going to direct us towards what kind of information we're looking for in these sources. So the question says, how successful was organized labor in improving the position of workers in the period from 1875 to 1900? Analyze the factors that contributed to the level of success achieved. So, kind of like in Say 3, we have to look at that question carefully. So, when I read that question and I highlight the most important parts, then really it's about success. So, in improving the position of workers. So, when I think about position of workers, then anytime I see evidence of a potential change in position for the worse or for the better, then that's evidence that I can use. And then when it comes to factors, that's the other main category of information. So what influenced those factors? So those are the two essential pieces of information that we're looking for. The position of workers in this time period and what influenced it. And then before we could develop a thesis and potential topics for defending that thesis, what we have to do is look at each one of these documents. Now, if you're like me, then you're not an expert on this period of history in America from 1875 to 1900. So while I know a decent amount about that history, I don't feel like I would be ready to answer that question with any kind of authority unless I did some research first. So in your homework, I had you go through and first use the documents and then come up with a thesis. So that's more or less the path that I'm going to follow. We're going to start with document A. We're going to go through document I, which is the last document, and then I'll read off the thesis that I've put together based on what I've found in these documents. So it does help to have a little bit of outside knowledge, and I hope that some of you, if you bumped into words or phrases that you were not familiar with, that you looked into them. I had to do this for several phrases in constructing my answer. So that's fine, and I hope you did that. So let's start with document A. Here, the source is the Historical Statistics of the United States, and it says hours and wages of industrial workers from 1875 to 1891. So in document A, what I know is here is that it's going to tell me something about the conditions of workers, because when we think about primary conditions of workers, in still today, these are conditions that we're concerned about. It's how much are you making, which are wages, and how long are you working for those wages. So when we look at this and we think about average daily hours, we nowadays think about 7-8 hours as an average workday. 8 hours being the I'd say most common time period used today. But this was a long time ago. So when I think about 1875 to 1891, that's about 2/3 of our block of time. And when I look at the average daily hours, they have a very, very moderate decrease. So a decrease in working hours would actually be an improvement in the workers' conditions. That said, it's only 0.5 hours over a 16-year period. So given that they started off at a pretty bad state of working about 10 hours a day, the improvement of 0.5 hours is a very small increase over a 16-year period. So it's not terrible, but they haven't achieved a lot of success in minimizing the amount of working hours. So then we have to go to the index of average daily wages. Now this fluctuates a little bit more. We start with 169.2 and we end at 172.5. So that over a 16-year period, you have a change of 3.3 in terms of the index. And we have a statistic here which says in January 1860, it was 100. That means that from 1860 to 1875, they were able to go from 100 to 169.2. That's a major change, but that's not the period we're analyzing. We're analyzing 1875 to 1891, and so in 16 years of effort, they were able to change the index 3.3. If you do a percentage, that's basically a increase of 2%. It's about a 2% increase. If you think about, we could use some of our other knowledge to factor these kind of conditions. We see it actually drops first and then starts to go up, and then drops back down, and then goes up a little bit. But in the end, you're 2% higher after 16 years. Now, if you think about inflation and how much wages change per year, then this is a concept that we will encounter in business English, but it's probably something you've heard of before. The economy generally expands at about 2 to 3% a year. So they are way behind the expansion of the economy. So what looks like a tiny increase, and a very tiny increase, is measured against inflation actually a loss. So after what document A shows us as far as conditions is that wages are not increased almost at all, 2% over 16 years, and against inflation, that's actually a loss. And their hours are a tiny bit better. So I don't think that's a lot of success over a 16-year period. So document A is all about conditions of workers. So document B, when we think about this, is from the New York Times, and it's an editorial. So an editorial is a opinion piece, and so it's not necessarily a fact-based piece. It's someone writing their opinion that is then published in a newspaper, and here it's a major newspaper, and this is 1877. So what I take from this is a short document, but it's clearly very against the workers. So there's been an attempted strike, so that means that organized labor exists. So in terms of factor, there is organized labor, but they call it hopeless, they call it rash, spiteful, they use words like resentment, ignorant, reckless, and those are all really negative terms. So what I get from this is, if this is a major newspaper and it is talking about organized labor movements with these kind of words, then it seems like the media is definitely against them, or at least this particular media. And New York Times is generally considered a liberal magazine. So if the liberal newspaper is this much against, and is going to use this kind of powerful language against the movement, then that's a bad sign. It seems like the media would be against them in this particular instance. They also do mention some slight positives, which is that while they might be reckless and they might be disorganized, that's a bad thing as far as organized labor, they are bold and determined, and they have the sympathy of a large part of the community in which they live. So when we think about factors, what document B tells me is that the media seems to be pointed against them. They seem to be a bit disorganized. They can strike, that is a right. And so that's, at least, let's say, neutral, they can do it. And they have some sympathy from the community. So the community is behind them. That seems like a somewhat of a positive. But the media is against them. Those are our major takeaways from document B. If we go to document C, this is a cartoon, and it's a pretty complex cartoon. This again comes from a major publication. It's Thomas Nast cartoon in Harper's Weekly. So that's a weekly journal that's published. This is in 1878. And there's some metaphorical language being used here. What I would say generally is that you have largely some kind of cartoon that is registering the opinion of media once again. And you have these phrases like always killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So you have this communist statesman who is apparently the one who, it's at the bottom, it says nothing in it after all, it's too bad. Now I just thought he was full of them. But Labor looks very distraught, very upset for having killed the goose. The goose is capital. You know, the golden goose is supposed to be the wonderful thing that gives and gives and gives, and here it's capital or industry. So this cartoon is portraying the industry or the corporations as golden giving victims who have been killed by labor. But labor, you can see the egg in his pocket, was convinced to do this by the communistic statesman. You have some very charged phrases: labor against capital, this land will be convulsed in agony, strike, 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 as they did last July, down with capital, up with the red flag, that's a symbol for communism. So, meanwhile, this woman and the child look very afraid and suspicious of this communistic statesman. So overall, what this is similar to what we had from the New York Times, a very negative portrayal of social labor movements. It's a very negative portrayal of communism as being a, let's say, philosophically objective, removed from responsibility presence, but that forces people like the laborers to make and do things that they would otherwise not do. Labor being too uneducated to think better of that, and then labor hurting the industry. So this is a pro-industry, anti-labor, anti-communist cartoon that presents industry as the victim and labor and communism as problematic activities with negative consequences. So those are the influence. Again, we have negative media and we have seemingly uninformed labor, but that's maybe some media bias. So if we go to document D, we have the testimony of a machinist before the Senate committee on labor and capital. So in a way, we have is a government who's at least looking into the matter. And the question is, how have things changed over 10 years when you look at the document? And unfortunately, what this worker says is that trade has been subdivided, and then again subdivided. So, and if we go through the entire commentary, what this worker seems to say is that there are fewer jobs, so there's been a loss of jobs. There's a loss of training, so the workers are less educated and less capable. They have a loss of status or integrity because you're no longer a machinist. You're just a piece in a manufacturing line, and you're overworked. So you have 300 or 400 men doing who gone, and now there's only 100 men. So you have overworked men with loss of jobs, loss of training, and loss of status. All of these are conditions which, from this document, reflect very poorly on progress being made. So if we think about our conditions better, well, in 1883, almost every condition here is worse. So loss of status, loss of training, loss of jobs, and overworked. And some technological change. So the corporations are taking advantage of the situation to basically hire as few people as possible, push them very hard, and the workers suffer the consequences in this factory-like system. So document E is a document from, it says Western Union Telegraph Company Employee Contract. Here it's a primary document, it's a contract, so this is what someone taking a job would sign. What document E tells us, if you go through it, is that the corporations are clearly against organized labor. Because if you want to be employed, and clearly there are fewer jobs available, we know that from document D, that there are industrial changes, which means that industry is technologically moving forward, and there are clear policies against workers. The unions seem to be weakening and losing power because if you want to work, you have to sign this contract not to engage in any union activity, not to enter any relations or membership whatsoever with such organizations, and that you abandon any and all membership, connection, or affiliation with any organization, society, etc., etc. So basically, we know that workers were losing status, losing training, losing jobs in the previous document. Now they're also losing some of their rights, like their right to protest and their right to unionize if they want to work. So basically, if you want a job, you lose rights. And this is right in the middle of the period we're here this is also in 1883. We're about the first third of the period. So far, things aren't looking good for the workers. If we go to document F, it's a much more simplistic cartoon than the first one we saw. Here it's Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. This uses an idiomatic phrase, too many cooks spoil the broth. So basically, or too many cooks in the kitchen is another way of saying it. So what is the broth and who's trying to do the cooking? Well, the broth is the labor interest broth. So these would be the people who are trying to organize labor and push them forward and hopefully fight for rights. The problem is you have the labor unions, the anarchists, the socialists, the Knights of Labor, and it seems like they're all fighting over who should represent labor. So what this does is it shows us again media negatively portraying labor interest, but also labor itself being very disorganized. Not only are they fighting against the media, seemingly, not only are they fighting against corporations who are trying to force them into non-union contracts and to reduce jobs and to not increase wages and to not change hours much, but now you have the movement itself divided, because it's not just one unified movement. It's labor unions, anarchists, socialists, Knights of Labor. We already saw the communists earlier. They're all fighting to represent the labor movement, but they're all fighting with each other. So you have infighting while you're trying to take on powerful entities. So this is not a good case, and this is 1887. So we have the media still against them, and we have a seemingly very disorganized movement. If we go to document G, this is a pretty complicated document, and the one that of all of them required me to do some research. And this says it's a coroner's list of the killed, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1892. And so it says, following are the names of those killed as furnished by the coroner. And you have a battle, because, someone from Silas Wayne who is watching the battle from the mill yard. So you have Pinkerton detectives, you have strikers. So we know that this was a strike because there are strikers. And then you have some other people named. You have of Homestead, of Homestead, of Homestead, of Homestead, a Pinkerton detective of New York. And then you have the final phrase, a number of others are reported dead, but the coroner has no official notification of their death. Now, this is a very interesting document, because if you look up what a Pinkerton detective actually is, then you will find that, and I had to look this up a few years ago when I did this first time, that Pinkerton detectives were actually government agents who would work as spies to try to cause problems in the labor movement. So the fact that Pinkerton detectives even exist is a problem, because it shows us that the government is taking action against labor. And this is 1892. Here we are 2/3 into our period, and you have the government who at first was, looking into it with labor committees, now taking an active role against labor in 1892. Because you see, and they're doing it on a wide scale, because this is in Pittsburgh on July 7th, but you have a Pinkerton detective from Chicago and a Pinkerton detective from New York. So those are other states. So you have the government hiring espionage agents to cause unrest and dissent and violence within the Labor Party as they try to do strikes. So the government's against them. And you have violence break out. And who suffers from that violence? Yes, a couple Pinkerton detectives die. You have a striker who's dead. You have a laborer who is dead. You have an employee who is dead. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who were watching. So what's very clear from this document for me, document G, is that the government is trying to make the labor movement seem as unpleasant, disorganized, and violent as possible, and they're putting spies in its ranks to make this happen. And the result is death. And the result is death to any supporters that might be out there. So you have laborers dying, and you have strikers dying, and you have people in the community dying, which is bound to turn them against labor very likely. And these are secret detectives. They're not out in the open detectives. So this is again published by the New York Times. Also, it says a number of others are reported dead, but the coroner has no official notification of death. Here it seems like they're trying to hide something as well. And who does the coroner work for? For the government. So it seems like the government is taking the side of corporations here. And if we go to document H, then we have the United States Supreme Court, and this is 1895. And it says the national government, given power by the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce, has by express statute assumed jurisdiction over such commerce when carried upon the railroads. So what this means is the government says that they can handle situations on the railroads when they deem it necessary. And this is the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. So it's a court case of, here it says, in response to Debs. And it says that the government's duty is keeping those highways of interstate commerce free from obstruction. For it has always been one of the powers and duties of government to remove obstructions from the highway under its control. So basically, when we think about what these obstructions are, then those would be protests. Those would be labor movements, rallies, parades, physical objects that prevent commerce from moving forward, because labor would be trying to fight for its rights. And they're essentially saying, if you're in the way and you're getting in the way of corporate commerce, we're going to remove you. So you have a government even more hostile than, or at least, I don't know, more hostile, but again, a government hostile to labor interests and their potential possibilities for fighting for their rights, like by obstructing commerce, by striking. So that is, again, an instance of government taking the corporation side and reducing what labor can do to fight against them. Then we have the final document. This is document I. This is testimony of Samuel Gompers before a commission established by the House of Representatives on the relations and conditions of capital and labor. And they've already ruled against labor in document H. So what's going on in document I? Here it says the working people find that improvements in the methods of production and distribution are constantly being made, and unless they occasionally strike or have the power to enter upon a strike, the improvements will all go to the employer and all the injuries to the employees. The American Republic was not established without some suffering, and no tangible right has yet been achieved in the interest of the people unless it has been secured by sacrifices and persistency. So what this shows is there's Samuel Gompers who's testifying on behalf of the labor movement, and that they need their fight to be secured, and they're willing to sacrifice, and they're clearly still persistent in their fight. But given that this individual is speaking for the right to strike, then what seems to be the case is the government is trying to decide, or has already decided, on striking as being an unlawful element. If this person is up there saying, we need to be able to strike, we have to have the power to strike, then very likely it's either being questioned by the government or has already been taken away by the government, and that would reflect the position already seen in document H. So when I think about, that being the last document, what overall has gone on here, then when I think about, are the workers' conditions better or worse? Was the labor movement successful? Then for me, wages haven't changed much. Working hours haven't changed much. And there are fewer jobs, worse job security, subdivision of trade, a loss of status in education and training, the government giving itself the ability to break apart obstructions, to work against striking and other methods that labor might use. And those are all conditions, including contracts that we also saw, which means that sometimes there's pressure from corporations to not allow laborers or workers to unionize at all, that the corporations definitely seem to be winning. So in a fight against corporations and technology and the government and the media, the labor union, and sometimes against itself, the labor interests are not doing a good job, and they've had very little success. So the corporations have made gains at the expense of the employees, and what little gains the employees have made are very small over a long period of time. And then when we think about factors, well, we've named them most. That's the other part of the question. What factors influence this? Well, you have quite a few. You have, based on the evidence here, a fractured movement with multiple self-interested parties trying to push labor rights forward, but fighting against one another at the same time, tripping over one another. You have strikes go awry. You have a government working against you. You have corporations working against you, contractually and technologically. And you have a media which seems, especially based on documents B and C and the other drawing, I'll use that one just a moment. Document F, to be ridiculing you and be against you. So when I bring this all together, then what I get is an answer to that original question. So if we go back to that original question after looking at these documents, and we have this question: how successful was organized labor in improving the position of workers in the period from 1875 to 1900? Analyze the factors that contributed to the level of success achieved. I would say that there was, not in a formal way, my quick answer would be they weren't very successful and there was a lot against them. Now, if I want to write that into a more formally stated thesis, then it's going to look something like this, and I'll read my thesis. From 1875, the zealous but fragmented workers' movement failed to achieve significant improvements in workers' positions, with many factors even registering losses on multiple fronts, confronted by an antagonistic media, a profiteering and technologically advancing industry, and a capital-sympathetic government. So how would I break that up? I think using that thesis, you could come up with a variety of ways to defend that in topics. I think maybe one logical way is to spend one paragraph and, paragraph one just analyzing the conditions. Another paragraph talking about the antagonism of the media, another paragraph talking about the antagonism of industry, and another paragraph talking about the antagonism represented by the government. And I think you would have, within those paragraphs, once the conditions were named in the first paragraph, an opportunity to talk about how each one of those antagonistic parties was working against particular conditions in the working movement. So that's my answer to the question. I'm looking through yours as you post them, and at this point I should have received all of them. So there will be more material coming in the week ahead. I know that it's a strange week because this weekend we're on lockdown and it's Easter, and then next weekend we're on lockdown again and it's another Easter. So we will not have material on Monday because that's an off day, but there will be material posted very likely on Tuesday, but we'll try to keep it a bit reduced because of the Easter holiday. So in the meantime, good luck with your continued work on academic writing and other subjects. Stay safe, stay healthy, I hope, and I will be getting in touch soon once again with some material that allow us to attempt other elements of research paper writing. Goodbye.